Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, the top 10 myths about the Shaolin Monks. Combining the inherent contradiction of warrior Buddhists with the legendary grand scale of Chinese military history, Shaolin monks have gotten some very interesting stories associated with them since the Emperor of China made the order official circa 496 AD. Some of these stories are just so interesting that you know they're probably not quite true, but you can't help but resist the urge to hear them. And here are 10 of our favorites. Number 10. Much of the combat technique was derived from Indian animals. The Kung Fu combat techniques favored in China are actually reported by scholars to have been Indian in origin. A mystic was supposed to have gone into the area of the Shaolin Temple and introduced fighting techniques he had modeled off the movements of animals, as if to give the organization a more benign, naturalistic air. As reported by National Geographic, though, it's believed by historians that in fact the Shaolin tradition comes from something a little less enlightened. The organization started out essentially as someone's private army, and the combat technique came from within the group itself. It's a bit less pleasant to imagine them as probably a bunch of mercenaries in the beginning that took on a religious angle, but at least it's a bit more grounded and relatable. Number 9. 13 monks save an emperor. One of the earlier and thus more far-fetched legends relates to an event purported to have happened circa 621. Emperor Tang Taizong was besieging a rebel city when another rebel army of 300,000 arrived. He asked the Shaolins for help and received 13 warriors. These 13 were credited with making a key attack at a crucial moment in the subsequent battle and saved the army from destruction. In a battle that involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, it's hard to imagine 13 being the key to the whole battle without picturing something out of a cartoon. Number 8. The training trap maze, i.e. Wooden Men Lane. The rigors of training for the organization naturally had to have exaggerated stories, especially for the final exam. A myth arose that beneath the temple there was a maze of wooden dummies that trainees had to get through. What this was spinning wooden poles with smaller poles branching out from them at varying lengths and heights that meant the monks had to use different techniques to get through. This maze was supposed to have 36 different dummies that you had to get through, and they were equipped with deadly blades. Number 7. The god Vaprapni hates bullying and vegetarianism. Vaprapni was a Hindu war god who was incorporated into Shaolin worship and was the focus of a particularly odd story from the 7th century AD. There was a monk named Sheng Chou that was a living punching bag in his monastery. He begged to Vaprani for help for 6 days. Vaprani appeared and then forced him to eat meat, an act which was taboo for a monk. From there, it's a typical nerd revenge fantasy where Sheng Chou demonstrates his great strength to his former tormentors and they beg him for mercy. Why the Shaolin tradition would want a story of someone being rewarded for betraying their vows solely out of petty self-interest is really rather curious. Number 6. Jinao Lu's exploit. In the mid-6th century, the Shaolin monks were dealing with an uprising from a group called the Red Turbans. At one point, the main body of monks had been called away from their temple, which was then attacked with only a small number of less distinguished personnel. One of them was a cook named Jinao Lu, who'd been studying Shaolin tactics in secret. His method of saving the day was to grab a large flaming log from a fire and use the staff techniques to scare the enemy away. Some versions embellished this story by having him grow into a giant, which actually sounds like it would be slightly less cool than a normal-sized man doing this. Number 5. The unusual way to join. Speaking of the 6th century, here's another legend from that period that's quite impressive, but for roughly the opposite reason. An Indian prince named Bodhidharma, changed to Dalmo, emigrated to China and was disgusted by the state he found the Shaolin temple in, and he let it be known. After predictably alienating everyone in and related to the temple, he went to a nearby cave and began a meditation session. According to some legends, it stretched out for 9 lunar cycles. In other words, it was 9 years. Whatever the case, this impressed the monastery so much that they let him into the order and even gave him his own room. Number 4. How to escape with style. In the mid-16th century, the monastery was called upon to defend China from raids by Japanese pirates. Providing 120 warriors, they fought the Japanese in 4 battles armed with 35-pound staves, and for the first 3, they inflicted sound, one-sided defeats, suffering at most 4 casualties. Then in the 4th, they were almost wiped out, with 3 exceptions, though history has blamed this on bad military leadership from people unrelated to the monks themselves. The story of the 3 is that they took reeds and then buried themselves for a night and then snuck away. It seems far-fetched and implausible, but also so undignified and specific that you have to wonder why anyone would make it up. Number 3. The Dashanmen, i.e. how to leave the order. Leaving the monastery on honorable terms was, for obvious reasons, not easy. In fact, a system was instituted that basically illustrated how those leaving had an unusually good grasp of the combat methods. 3 monks would group together and then face off in combat against 18 others. You'd think word of this would never be allowed out for fear of how every time any 3 monks left, it meant that very likely they'd just lost by far 3 of their best fighters. Nevertheless, stage reenactments of this myth are part of the Shaolin performing repertoire today. Number 2. The strange origin of tea bushes. This relates to the same event that happened in myth number 5, but it's so strange that it deserves a separate entry. You'll recall it was said that the Indian prince immigrant spent 9 years in meditation in a cave in order to contemplate the failings of the Shaolin monastery. Well, apparently those 9 years were very hard because in year 7 he fell unacceptably asleep. Therefore, he cut his own eyelids off to prevent any more of that unacceptable behavior. When his amputated eyelids hit the soil, they changed into the first tea bushes. This was presumably nature's way of honoring his sacrifice, which would totally blind him in real life. Probably the real reason this was concocted was because they thought an unappetizing legend would make monks a bit less eager to use up the tea supply. Number 1. The needle through glass. Probably the most widely publicized single myth in the Shaolin legacy, except of course for Kung Fu Panda, is this video of a monk throwing a needle through a piece of glass like his arm has converted it into a bullet. Controversially, this myth was busted on, well, Mythbusters of course. Shaolin fans claim that the trick shown in this video involves a combination of using a stronger needle than the one used to test the myth and a thinner pane of glass. In fact, Wired reported that a German TV show had managed to replicate the demonstration years before Mythbusters failed. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also check out some of our videos from the archives over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.